Hi, I'm Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. You can find out everything there is to know about the Veterans Breakfast Club on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. Welcome to VBC's now fifth episode of Lioness, the Origin Story. This is a special 8-part podcast where Lioness vets and those who know the history of the Lioness program dive into that history along with the FETS, female engagement teams, and leading into the cultural support teams. We have a very exciting episode planned for you today. Joining me again are filmmaker and writer Daria Sommers and Army veteran Shannon Morgan. In 2008, filmmaker and writer Daria Sommers, along with her filmmaking colleague Meg McLagan, released Lioness, a documentary that revealed the history of a group of women support soldiers who went to Iraq in 2003 as mechanics, clerks, and engineers, but ended up serving as the original Lioness soldiers. Although the Lioness's mission was to diffuse tensions with Iraqi women and children, they fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Iraq War. Shannon Morgan was a member of that original group of Lioness soldiers, an Army mechanic from Mena, Arkansas. She served in Ramadi from 2003 to 2004. During the 2004 battle for Ramadi, she was one of a group of Army Lioness soldiers attached to the 2 Marines during house-to-house searches. That put her at the center of some of the fiercest street fighting of the war. I am very honored to be continuing this podcast with you all. And Daria, we have a special guest. I'd love to hand it off to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, and hello to all our listeners. At this midway point in our podcast, episode 5, as Sean mentioned, we have the perfect guest to help us put in perspective the hot potato position women serving in Iraq and Afghanistan found themselves in, due in large part to the disconnect between the boots on the ground reality and political resistance back home to giving women full equality in the services. Joining us today is retired Navy Captain Lory Manning, who is literally the expert on policies and laws governing women's participation in the U.S. military. She played a critical role during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict, providing background and history on the issues concerning women in the military to Congress. She was right there as Congress and top military leaders confronted the uncomfortable reality that Army and Marine women were, in order to achieve the mission, being asked to operate outside the policies that prohibited women from direct ground combat. After more than 25 years in the Navy, Lory served as director of the Women in the Military project at the Women's Research and Educational Institute, and more recently as the director of government operations for the Service Women's Action Network, where she currently sits on the board. She's been awarded the Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal, 3 awards, Navy Commendation Medal, Navy Unit Commendation Ribbon, Meritorious Ribbon, and National Defense Medal. And we're also welcoming back Shannon. Hi, Shannon. So we wanted to, at this point, in episode 4, our guest was, we had 2 women Marines on. One of them she retired as a colonel after 28 years in service, Maria Marte, and the other is Colonel Maria Pilata, MJ, who teaches at the United States Naval Academy. And we listened to some fascinating stories, one of which was in 2004, Captain Marte at the time was in Afghanistan, where she and women in her unit were being sent outside the wire for 3 to 4 weeks at a time. And not in some instances, not really knowing how long they'd be gone, which was a very sort of loose interpretation of the rules at that time. And so they would just go out with the Marines and they would live and go on their missions together. But then in 2005, there was, I think it was on June 24th, the Marines were delivering each day to a Fallujah checkpoint from a more secure base, female Marines to act as searchers, but they wouldn't let them overnight with the Marines, so they had to send them back and forth each day. And there was a terrible bombing, and 4 women Marines were killed. It may have been 3 Marines and 3 women Marines and 1 sailor, and at least 11 were seriously injured. And that was all because of this disconnect about what to do with women. And I was wondering, are you familiar with that incident? Because it seems
yes.
like, yeah, women are still sort of like, are we in? Are we out? What can we do? What can't we do?
Yes, I'm very familiar with that. It was an unnecessary tragedy, I think. And the disconnect was that people on the ground and the women Marines you mentioned first were in Afghanistan. These other women who were killed were in Iraq. The policy, which came about in 1994, that said women could not be assigned to any unit below I think it was the brigade level that had a combat mission, was interfering with the on-the-ground commanders who were not mostly generals. They might be at the colonel or lieutenant colonel level, or sometimes down at the platoon level. Without women to work with the Iraqi or Afghani women, or sometimes the only woman available is, say, a medic, had to go. It was decisions they made locally to sort of ignore the national position and do what had to be done in the instant. So the Marines in Iraqi, again, in Iraq, in Fallujah, made a decision that the women had to be pulled back every night, while other Marines fighting different battles in Afghanistan let them go out for 3 or 4 weeks or longer. And it's because there was no instruction coming to these poor commanders from the national level. So they had to just sort of make up their own rules. And one of the first rules that sort of was a rule of thumb, it was never officially talked about, was to take that word "can't be assigned" to mean that they can't be given they can't be given permanent change of duty orders to a unit with a combat assignment, but they could be attached to that unit for nobody knew how much time. So every commander sort of made it up on his own, made his own decision on it. And they were all his decisions at that time. So you have a Marine commander in Afghanistan letting people go out for 3-4 weeks and actually stay with and sleep next to or beside the infantry. And you have the same Marine Corps, but a different country and a different leader deciding no, that those women couldn't spend the night sleeping in their sleeping bags on the ground. They had to come back. And these poor guys had no guidance from above. They were doing what had to be done. And because of the politics surrounding this, the Washington, D.C. level people did not want to make a decision that said, okay, go ahead and let the women do what they have to do, because they would get in trouble with Congress. And there was a big commotion in Congress about it when it started coming out. So yes, and the poor women who were going out there were caught being sent on combat missions without much training, without proper equipment, and with people not even keeping records that they had been out there.
There's an ambiguity in what you've described that seems like it's the antithesis of what you would want in the military. Because in training and preparedness, things have to be understood. What's the mission? What do you do? What can you do? How are we going to do it? And by having this ambiguity, it's not about, critiquing or finding blame with any of the lower level officers, but it's more of a lesson, right, in what goes wrong when there's not clarity.
Right. And also, even if there was clarity in this, women can't go on combat missions, the reality was that they had to.
Right.
And
thus the
so
ambiguity.
thus the ambiguity. And the leaders in Iraq and Afghanistan did what needed doing, but it was a very dangerous situation for the women, but also for the men that they were working with. because
Right.
of the differences in training, and I know Shannon has the story about the differences of Army people working with Marines when you're in a combat situation without knowing that each other's signals and things. So yeah, it's necessary and it's dangerous, and it was I think it was lily-livered on the part of the military commanders back home to not tell Congress we got to do this, and we've got to take care to make sure the women who go have training, that VA knows they've gone when they come back, that there are records of what they were attached to, because it protects not only the women, but the men they're having to serve with.
Absolutely. And another interesting aspect of this, which actually you're the one who can speak to this. So if you use the June 24th, 2005 incident with the Marines returning from or being in the military convoy going back and forth to the Fallujah checkpoint, when that happened, like, what is the conversation like back in Washington between Congress and the military leaders? Are they addressing it? Are they confronting it? What's the situation?
They ignored it. They were sorry that the people were killed, but Congress could point at now Congress is not a unified body, but there were people who did not like the idea of women in the military who could point out and say the policy says you can't do this. And the military people could have pointed back, we have to do this. But they just avoided it. It was a tragedy. It was one of those things that happened. And whether or not it could have been avoided, that question was simply ignored.
That's kind of stunning.
Isn't it?
I mean, I'm only quiet because it's stunning, because I remember, it being reported, the reports are still available, and
sure.
It was like, wow, what happened, and just feels like something that could have been avoided. Was there anyone back home speaking up, like trying to get people to listen within the services?
Oh yes, not so much within the services. Well, but there are groups like mine, the Women's Research and Education Institute, talking with Congress and saying, hey, this is a problem. And I know there were individual commanders within the Army and the Marine Corps too, who kept trying to get the attention of their senior bosses. These were usually commanders on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan who have to deal with the problem and who came up with their own solutions individually, and even those on the ground weren't really coordinated. And when they tried to get the attention or filed the reports saying what they were doing, the generals back home didn't want to touch it. It was a very touchy issue. It was politically hot potato, if you will, and nobody wanted to take the flak for it.
And because of that, and Shannon, I'm sure that you can relate to this, women were left in this kind of nebulous status where, depending on who was your superior, who you were taking orders from, you could go one way or the other, depending on, I think in one of our previous guests said whether they were doing the spirit of the law or the letter of the law, which was really a policy backed by law.
And it's hard to know which direction to go when your orders exist, but they don't exist, so to speak. It's hard to know how to react and adapt to a situation. All those times were brand new, and females entering into frontline combat, I think a lot of people in DC didn't know what to do. But as far as boots on the ground, us over there, we knew if they didn't make some decisions, there were going to be a lot of females put at even more risk than what needed to be at the time.
Well, this is something I want to ask you, Shannon. Then, were you, and do you think other women who were serving as lionesses, were you aware of all of sort of the political situation, or were you aware at the time that what you were doing was all sort of being measured against this combat exclusion policy, and how far to the left or the right you were being ordered to go?
I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, because deep down, we knew that we were in a gray area that hadn't been addressed yet. So we knew that we were operating within different scopes of what your normal female assignments would be. But as far as the political aspect of it, no, it's really hard because it was the beginning of the war. There weren't a lot of comms up, and we didn't really have TVs and things like that to watch. And I remember ending up on a Marine base, and I actually seen TV footage of the White House secretary claiming that, you know, these rumors of females in frontline combat was just rumors. And I thought to myself, wow, so even if one of us does die over here, they're just going to cover it up like it never existed. And I was like, well, is it going to take one of us dying for policy change to come to be fully enacted, and for them to actually give us the proper training and equipment like our male counterparts? I always feared that, and the loss of those Marines, as you speak of, was just that. That's exactly what happened.
Well, yes, but Lory, according to you, even that incident, which I just remember the headlines, and it just caught everyone's attention, at least in the public, even that wasn't enough to make people respond with, you know, who could look at change the policy.
Right, because the policy wasn't changed for a number of years after that happened. And what happened was people that did not want women in the military within Congress and some of the think tanks and those sorts of things used the death of those women Marines to say, see, we've got to get them all out of there because they shouldn't be in combat. That argument was made. This wouldn't happen if you hadn't done that. And really, one of the reasons that the Army women were involved with the Marines is because the Marine Corps itself had not sent very many women over to Iraq and Afghanistan at that time. They didn't have women of their own, so they had to borrow some from the Army over there. So even between the services, the Army was making much better use of its women than the Marines were, who were sort of keeping them back out of the theater of war altogether. Even though the Marines over there knew, we're borrowing women from the Army because we don't have any of our own who know how to fight as Marines, as opposed to the Army women who came out without knowing who were out there in battle without knowing some of the standard Marine Corps procedures, because nobody had even thought to tell them. And it was
nobody had imagined. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So it was known, but what you had happen in the wake of those women being killed was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Duncan Hunter, adding a provision to the National Defense Authorization Act, which deals with military policy, on a Friday night. And the language, and I don't remember the exact wording of the language, would have required most of the services, all the services really, to pull most of the women out of Iraq and Afghanistan. which would have been a disaster. I mean, back in those days, it wasn't like World War II where you had mostly only a few very junior women and maybe you could get away with removing them. By this time, there were women generals there. There were very skilled enlisted women there who were professional at their jobs at every level of the chain of command, and lots of them. If you had suddenly pulled them out, you would have been short about 10 or 15% of your forces and some of the skills you needed and some of the leaders you needed, both on the enlisted and the officer side. And he just did it on a Friday night, and without telling DOD he was putting it in there, and the vote was scheduled for the following week. And it took, as I understand, that intervention from the White House to get him to pull that out of the NDA. So that was the battle that was going on back in DC, is not let more women go, but get them all out of there. It was one of those really two different versions of what we ought to be doing in the political arena.
Was that in 2005?
Yeah, it was the NDAA for 2005, so it might have been in 2004. It was whenever they were having the debates on that.
Okay, so this was even prior to the tragedy for the searchers who were traveling outside of Fallujah.
It could have been. I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure when exactly that debate happened, but it was in the 2004-05 timeframe. The whole debate is in the congressional record.
What's interesting to me, given what you've described, Lory, and also Shannon, what you've described as your experiences, like, watching a White House press conference saying, "Oh yeah, women aren't doing anything." Is that in 2005, that's the date given when both the Marines and the Army say they formalized and began the training for their own Lioness programs. And there's an irony there, because women still remained in this ambiguous state. Congress wouldn't recognize it, but the Army and the Marines went ahead and formalized their own Lioness programs. And I think this is where things just out of necessity started to split. Does that sound true?
And there was also in the NDAA for that year, after they, I'm thinking now it was the 2006 the bill that was going to affect that would go into effect starting in October 2005, not the 2005 appropriations bill. After Duncan Hunter was told to back down, what they did was offer a compromise in which there was a study made about what women were doing over in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they began to talk about the Army, or the military, having to notify Congress when they made changes to ground combat exclusion policy, which hadn't been necessary before that. The ground combat exclusion policy that we've been talking about dated back to 1994, and it was based on the outcomes of the Gulf War and what had happened in the Gulf War. And it opened a lot more jobs to women, but it put that business about cannot be assigned to ground combat units in there. And so they loosened things up a little in the 2006 NDAA. But that particular provision, it didn't really solve the problem, because they were talking about the policy at the big level, not about what individual commanders were doing with it in Iraq or Afghanistan, if that makes sense. They were talking about decisions made at the DC level had to be reported to Congress, not choices that a captain or a colonel made because it was expeditious to get his mission done in Iraq or Afghanistan.
No, I understand what you're saying, and it was almost like they were, instead of dealing with the big picture problem, they were tinkering on some of the details.
Yeah, and still avoiding the big issue. There was an elephant in the room, and they were worrying about the mice.
Right. That's a very good way of putting it. Because, I mean, I guess by 2005, the Lioness programs for both the Army and the Marines were formalized, and there was some supposedly additional training. I know there was some at Camp Pendleton, and I know there was some in the Army as well. But then in 2009, without anything having changed, the Marine Corps created female engagement teams. And their missions went beyond the Lioness teams because they not only searched, right, but they ran medical clinics, distributed medicine, humanitarian aid. This was mostly, I guess, in Afghanistan. They were engaging with women and children in their homes. But again, they were attached to combat units, or they were accompanied combat units, whatever you want to say. And then they were pulled back and forth, I mean, depending on who was suddenly concerned.
Yes, and who the local commander was, because they each sort of made their own choices. And when the FETs came along, I think that for the most part, they actually did that as their assigned job. The Lionesses were still, particularly in the beginning, were still doing their day job and then going on these raids at night. The FETs, it was more of a full-time job, I think. And it was pretty much limited to Afghanistan, as I understand it. And also some of our allies began doing the same thing, the Australians and the British. And I've heard also maybe some of the American civilians operated over there, like the idea, and maybe some of the intelligence agencies picked up doing it also. But it wasn't broadcast much.
Wow. But again, all of this was done, and the combat exclusion policy still remained in place. We know it didn't get repealed until 2013, but even though these programs had become formalized on some level, it didn't actually resolve the ambiguity.
No, and and they were usually described as programs more as a searching program or an intelligence gathering program, because the Iraqi and Afghani women would talk to the women FETs or the Lionesses or later the cultural support teams, but so would the men. And sometimes a lot of the male leaders would tell things to the women that they wouldn't tell to the men. So it became a very good intelligence gathering operation, as well as keeping things calm when there were searches and things, because the women could be searched by another woman. The women and children could be protected in some ways by being put with the women on the FETs and that sort of thing. But it evolved from beyond searching into a very good intelligence gathering thing. It tended to be the women in a village who knew, for instance, what sort of projects were needed. Did they need a new well? Did they need, health care of some sort? And that we often used projects in these villages to win friends. And the women were very good at finding out what was really needed in each place. So that it became an intel operation in many ways.
That's so interesting, because Shannon, that's what Colonel Brinkley was talking about in terms of what on an initial level you and the original Team Lionesses were doing as well.
Absolutely. Well, not every mission was boots on the ground combat mission. When we would go out with our Army County counterparts, most of that was knock and talks or meet and greets. And sometimes that was the mission, to just solely go out and find what that community needed. from us, i.e., school equipment and books and things for the children, or something like Lory speaking to, a new well, or maybe have a building rebuilt or something to that effect. A lot of those times, I'm going to say, in my experience, we actually gathered more intelligence out of common and not scary situations. We actually gathered more intelligence that way. They were more forthcoming. It's funny how if your house isn't being raided in the middle of the night, how you're more willing to talk.
No, so I mean, I like hearing those stories because it kind of connects. Even though the female engagement teams, had a more sort of integrated mission, and they sort of thought out about connecting medics with them and supplying medicine, which is. But you can see how it all evolved out of the original Lioness mission. And I like Lory. I like the mention that, because I just want to revisit it for a second. The Afghan men often ended up feeling more comfortable speaking with members of the female engagement team.
Yes, the vets I've talked to and some of the cultural support team people I've talked to mentioned that to me more than once over the years, and they were sort of fascinated by the idea of women in uniforms, military women. It's not something they saw much in their own cultures at that particular time, at least. And they just found, a lot of the guys were just sort of entranced by the whole idea, and maybe wanted to show off a little bit. Who knows?
No, absolutely. Well, so I'm wondering, Lory, if you could then lead us from, so you had the female engagement teams.
Mm-hmm.
How did we get to cultural support teams?
Well, cultural support teams, the female engagement teams were going out with Army and Marine normal units. The cultural support teams really were a special ops project. Army Rangers, Green Berets, Delta people, Navy SEALs, and I think it was an Army special ops thing in particular, but with the Marines too. And they went through 6 or 7 weeks of training at Fort Bragg on weapons handling, on some language stuff, on cultural matters. But they traveled with the special ops people in particular, as opposed to just any old unit. And what I've heard is that the Army special ops were much more welcoming to the women than maybe the Navy SEALs. And that the effect of the cultural supports team, how effective they were, kind of depended on how much the men in whatever special ops unit they were working with let the women merge in and be part of the unit, as opposed to, oh, what do we need those people for? Why are they sending us these people? And they, as I said, they traveled with special forces, doing much the same. Sometimes they got in firefights, but they were doing much the same kind of work that the FETs did or the Lionesses did, but with, as I said, with the special ops.
What I've heard, because again, it's as much as this evolves, and it sort of seems that if you look at the arc of the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, because I guess the female engagement teams really began in around 2009, 2010 in Afghanistan. And then in 2010, this is according to what I gleaned from different papers and things that have been written on it. Around 2010, they started to develop the cultural support teams and send them out. Mm-hmm. So you're having this evolution, this very specific kind of evolution. And I know that, just to be clear, we recognize that women were also doing other things, whether they were helicopter pilots and sort of pushing the envelope in other aspects as well. And this wasn't the only, but there is a through line in this narrative where, again, they're just kind of like expanding from where Shannon started out into kind of a more sophisticated, to some extent, developed program by the time you get to cultural support teams. But nevertheless, politically, back in Congress, they're still operating under this cloud of ambiguity. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because I've heard, and I've actually listened to cultural support team members speak about how after returning, they still, like you, Shannon, had trouble getting services that they needed from the VA because technically they couldn't claim on their DD-214 being in combat.
And it's still an issue 20 years later, Daria. It blows my mind that I can go to the VA and have a conversation with a male counterpart, and especially being in a PTSD group, and them look at you and say, what the hell are you talking about? Females in frontline combat. I still, to this day, get laughed out of some rooms. And I have been saying since 2008 or 9, when we went to the Hill, Daria, I have been saying and asking, why can we not have something put in their service record in our DD-214s that say you were part of a Lioness program? That right there will bump you up with the VA instantly. I mean, it's one thing we have to go out there and we have to be a part of these engagement teams and scream and holler, hey, we're out here, we're doing this. And then you have to go to the VA and you have to prove it yet again. I mean, I don't understand why. It's a simple, quick fix, if you ask me. If we could start enforcing something when we exit the military, if it's put in our DD-214, that's half the freaking battle right there when you go to try to get your benefits from the VA. It's too easy.
Shannon is precisely right. And I went on some of those tours with some of the Lionesses to Congress to talk about this. And VA was given instructions, you got to do this, but big VA and getting the word down to the regions that make the veterans determinations and to each of the local offices where those are made, it's like playing grapevine as a child. What is put out by big VA never gets down to the people that are making the decisions. And who's hurt? The same women who were put out there in combat without proper training are now not getting credit for it because their commands never made an entry in their records saying, oh, you know, she was Team Lioness, and it's a crime.
Yeah. No, it definitely is, because these women, like any of the women serving, like any of the men serving, by the very fact that they were serving, were putting their lives on the line. So
yeah, and one thing that never comes through when we talk about what was forbidden by the old policies, that women couldn't be assigned to units with a combat mission or have a combat occupation. The law has never forbade, or the policy has never said women can't be in combat. They could be in combat under those policies. They just couldn't have the training and the credit for it.
Correct. Amen, Lory. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Well, this brings up two issues. And again, Lory, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time, but I can't let you go without raising a couple of more issues for you to respond to. One is, just briefly, why and maybe someone is doing this, and maybe someone has already started it, and we don't know about it. But you'd think that in retrospect, after we're at a point now where we can look back at both conflicts, have more or less come to an end, and we can look back at them. Why isn't there a like a pin for if you served as a Lioness or an FET or a cultural support team? Why isn't there a special recognition for it?
Well, it never occurred to anybody to ask for it.
Okay.
And the Army had to make a change. They used to give combat action, I think they still do. In the infantry, there was a special award for somebody who had actually been in combat. Yeah. And on a lot going on in the Army, because a lot of men were also being thrown into combat who hadn't been through combat training. People like people that were the cooks or the whatever found themselves there too. And they were in a unit with certain men getting the combat action badge or ribbon, whatever it is, but they didn't, even though they were in the same unit doing the same thing. And the same applies to a lot of the women who were Lionesses. Some of the men probably got combat action and the women didn't. The Army finally had to come out with another combat action ribbon, not the infantry one, but at least one that said combat.
Right.
But that didn't take place until about halfway through the wars.
Okay. Well, I guess it's maybe there's still hope. It's something that could be addressed at some future point, because I feel that the further that away we get from Iraq and Afghanistan, anyone who played in the role or served in the roles of Lioness and FET or a cultural support team, that's going to go down in history as playing a very specific role, not only in the conflict, but in sort of the forward movement of women in the services and what they can do and what they can contribute. So, and then I can't let our time together end without asking this question, unless Shannon, if you have any questions, jump in. I don't want to hold you back.
No, you're good, Daria.
Okay. Because so I have to bring up Taylor Sheridan's show.
Yes.
And I have two questions. One is so with the cultural support teams, they were really the group that is operating with the special ops, whether it's the Rangers, the Berets, the SEALs.
Yes.
And the basis for Taylor Sheridan's show, forget the name for a second, is just that there's a Marine who gets the CIA goes in and finds a Marine to use as an asset, and the CIA has started their own Lioness program, so everybody wanted to get on board, I guess. But they started their own, and they called her a Lioness, and it's more contemporary. But how? And so a lot of the press in reviewing the show has been, well, what's the realistic basis of this show? What's the inspiration? How true was it? And so, as far as we know, the cultural support teams being in special ops is as far as the public knows of the connection. Was there a private program that the CIA had going where they called women Lioness and used those Lioness assets to go out and undercover and do things? Does that seem plausible?
It's plausible, but I don't know that it happened. If it has, it stayed very well buried. But the CIA certainly, and other intel people were certainly over there operating, but I never heard even a little whisper about a CIA program like that. Although, as I said, people like the British and the Australians had them. But I've looked at a few of those episodes, and it's like I used to go to submarine movies with a guy who had been a submariner, and he would get up and leave halfway through because, frankly, it's entertainment. It's not real. But the scary thing is that people watch it and think it's real, and that reality, that false reality, erases the real accomplishments of the women who were lionesses and FETs and CSTs. And it's particularly since they use the term lioness, it would have been better if they could call them tigresses or something, so that there couldn't be any confusion.
That's right. And I think that, and Shannon, you can speak to this, but that's what I think what a lot of the ill feeling that has been provoked by the use of that title, the application of that title on this show, which wasn't necessary, but clearly the word lioness had military currency, but it didn't sit well with women who had served in that capacity for one of its iterations.
Absolutely not. And myself and my counterparts all pretty much feel the same about that, Daria. I mean, here we were, started a program that a lot of people really tried to bury. They really tried to, I mean, here we are 20 years later, and like Lory spoke to earlier, there's this thing called the Combat Action Badge, which is assigned to females. It is supposed to be equal to the Combat Infantry Badge, which is only assigned to male counterparts. And I think it's funny, 20 years later, here they are making a show about it. And we're still fighting for benefits, and we're still fighting for the rights to even be acknowledged. I mean, we were over there doing it. It wasn't being talked about. It was actually actively trying to be covered up. And then all of this comes out, and I mean, where are we now? How is it any different today? And you're going to choose Lioness as your title? I mean, we're all still really jaded about that. I'm not sure about the rest of the females. I know I never got, it's funny, we started the program, but yet I still don't have that Combat Action Badge. It's craziness. Wow. And it's nowhere my DD 214 either. So.
Right. I don't think it was retroactive. That's my understanding. Yeah. But I otherwise, all of you could have applied for it and gotten it.
Right. They actually said that to me once. They were like, "Oh yeah, you were a lioness. Where's your cab badge?" And I was like, "Yeah, got me there." It's funny. My unit actually started it, but nope, it's not retroactive. I can't have one.
Right. And that it would be interesting to get to find somebody in Congress that would be willing to take on that battle. And maybe I'll suggest that to some of the groups that work on servicewomen's issues to make, we made the WASPs veterans retroactively. Why can't we award a cap to those on the Lionesses who did what people now earn that badge for before it was a badge? I think that would be a good thing for us to take up with Congress.
There's going to be thousands of females that have been left out in that aspect, Lory.
Yeah,
thousands.
And that's fine. Then they earn that badge. They ought to get it retroactively. I think I'm going to talk to some people about that. Can't guarantee any success, but I will take that on, Shannon. I think you've given me something that needs doing.
Wow. If we can get that going, that would be amazing, because that's going to retroactive lots of females, and that's thousands of female stories that fall on deaf ears, because if you don't have the proof in your record, they literally think you're just lying and making stuff up. I don't know any male that goes to the VA and says, "Hey, I was in combat," and they're like, "Prove it, you're a liar."
Right. They just no. Your sex is all the proof you need. I think, and the law. I think the law says that.
And that's how it goes when you're teamed up too. I mean, as long as you're another male counterpart, They already see you as fit for the bill, and they think you're capable and proficient at your job. But you show up as a female with some boobs, you don't know what you're doing.
Right. You have to prove it, and the other guy has to screw up before he's discredited. And I mean, majorly screw up.
Yes.
It would be amazing if someone, if we could get somehow some traction on this. And I will just say, when Meg and I started working on Lioness, we were thinking about it 2003, started working on it more 2004. And then we finally finished the film in 2008. But looking back, just as someone who was learning about this, and looking back now, really, 20 years later from when the idea first started to germinate, it's amazing on the one hand how little progress in some ways has been made on that. I mean,
yeah,
because in 2009 we were up on the hill talking to anyone and everyone who would listen.
Yeah, I mean, the big change in 2013 was that women were finally allowed to be in the infantry and in all ground combat designators, or whatever you call them, occupations, and in all ground combat units. But the women who did that before, who pioneered it, who proved women could handle themselves very well indeed, have been left out of the picture. And their history hasn't come out. We need, the Lioness documentary is one of the few things that captures it. And it may be the only thing that really captures it.
Right. Well, Lory, I want to thank you so much for giving us so much of your time and your experience, because I feel like at touching base with you at this midpoint in the podcast, it really gives us a perspective of, where we are in this sort of evolution, these iterations, because I've always seen like the Lioness to the FETs to the cultural support teams is just over the arc of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan as, there's an evolution there. They're not the same, but one evolved, one idea helped evolve another, I would say.
Yes, and the standard of performance set by the women Lionesses also was part of that. The fact that they could do it, that they did it well, led on to the next opening. And they need a lot more recognition than they've gotten.
They absolutely do. But thank you so much, Lory. I really appreciate it. This has been an invaluable hour. And just the context that you've been able to provide as we now will continue with our episodes on the FETs and the cultural support teams, just been fantastic, because I think now that we have a better echo chamber to continue to go through this history as well as we can on this podcast. So thank you very much for joining us for this hour.
It's my honor to be here with you and Shannon too.
Hey, Lory, it was great catching up with you. You always got the right words, and you never stop fighting for soldiers and females in general. And I can't thank you enough from the bottom of my heart. If there's anything I can do to help, with getting something in our service record, you have my email now. Please email me anytime.
Well, and it's great touching base with you again, Shannon. It's an honor to hear your voice. I'll tell you, you were one of the primary leaders of this, and thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And I just have to reiterate that, because as someone coming from outside and trying to find out what was going on, for all the years that I was doing with Meg, the research on the film and finding out what's going on, everything came down when you ever had a question that it was like, well, if no one else knows it, we're going to ask Lory. And you really held this whole thing together. I feel like you were the the touch base for all of this, and for so many of us finding out about it, and for people in the VA trying to figure out what was going on. And thank you so much, because it was it was a service beyond your service that you continued really your entire life. So thank you so much.
Well, I remember meeting you and Meg over at the Smithsonian Institute cafeteria one Saturday when we started talking about this. So, and you guys carried through with it. It was great.
I know. Well, that's, once we got an idea in our head, that was it. But anyway, so we'll catch up another time, but thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Shannon and Sean.
Yes, ma'am. You have a good day.
You too. Bye.
So episode 5, I love these titles. Truth is the shrewdest lie. Okay, so that's after Cruz wakes up, and her team had rescued her after she was almost sort of date raped. She had been given a date rape drug, and then she was saved. So she gets separated because her team has to go in and rescue her from that, while the Nadia and her group leave quickly when it gets too quiet. But the real drama is at home when Joe's daughter gets in that car accident,
right?
Which seems and then you find out she's pregnant. And I gotta say, in every episode there's a major female drama, either attempted rape or you're getting pregnant. Anyway, there's not just a mission. I don't know if you noticed that.
Oh, no, definitely. I have. I mean, it makes for good television drama, I suppose. But I like how I do like how they show the fact of their roles don't just stop when the end of the day rolls around. I mean, they have to continue on until their home life, and they have to be able to be there for their job and be there for their families at the same time. Zoe Saldana's character, she's torn between being full-time but not full-time for her mission and taking care of her home life. And unfortunately, you can see how that plays out. It comes down to the dad to really set the rules. And at one point he says, I sacrificed the top to save the bottom.
Right.
I mean, that really just kind of hits, it makes you think.
No, and I mean, it's the constant, when you do return home, it's extremely intense. And then when you're off on assignment, it's also extremely intense. And so there's kind of no let up ever.
Absolutely. And for the females, there's no time for them to stop and take a break and gather themselves. It's from one mission into their home life mission.
That's right. And then I thought it was interesting. I mean, they are amplifying the plot when everyone and they take Cruz is conveniently back with the team, and they go on that mission where they find terrorists in a house in San Antonio, and they basically take everyone out. And I was trying to figure out then in episode 6, because when they get called on I thought this was very interesting. In episode 6, they get called on, so then they have the snatch that was in an earlier episode where they had to capture a prisoner who was being transported. And then they have the San Antonio, where I guess they had to blow up the house because of the explosives. And so then they have that meeting, I guess it's with the CIA director or something.
Mm-hmm.
But afterwards, Caitlin, Nicole Kidman's character, and Zoe Saldana's character, they don't trust what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
There's something, they leave you with the sense that something is, they're not being told, they're being told stuff, but it's not there's something else going on. Not that they would expect to be told everything, but it doesn't make any sense why they're going on the mission. But Zoe Saldana's character says something interesting, because she says that if the Lioness can't sort of take out the terrorist funder who she's supposed to be getting to, then they're just going to order some kind of strike and take out everybody. Oh, and the Lioness will just be a casualty.
Right.
So I don't know if you caught that, but I thought that was a bit wild.
I did. Zoe literally says that she's aware of her parameters, and she's aware of the dangers that taking on this mission might entail. It just goes. It's the same kind of feeling 20 years later that I had in 2003. You know, it kind of coincides with the same feeling that we all experienced over there. Here we are doing this, but it's being lied about, like we're not doing it. So would our sacrifice even matter? And I mean, that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm gonna wait and see. So we have now 2 more episodes. It's, stuff's really gonna have to happen in the next 2 episodes to resolve this, at least for the first season, I guess. And then of course Nadia and Cruz have that moment at the end where I guess Nadia is so like, on the one hand, it seems a little contradictory. She's screaming with joy when she finds out she's getting married in Mallorca, which is, of course, what everyone wants to know is where's the wedding, because that's where,
right,
presumably Cruz is going to be able to get access for her target. But the night before, Nadia was so depressed when she got married, she'd have to return to Riyadh and basically be hidden away as a married woman, like no longer able to come out and have fun, apparently. And so there's that moment where Cruz and Nadia just both kind of come together, like they've never found love, they've never found the kind of comfort in another human being that they've sought, but then they find it briefly in each other, but then Nadia pulls away.
Right. I think that was a real come to Jesus meeting there. And I think Cruz realized that she's going to have to make some on the fly decisions. I mean, that was a moment she had to react in. And I mean, as a lesbian, I'm going to say that, I think she got more than what she bargained for on that.
Well, I agree with you on that, because I'll just we can probably end this on the note that last look on the episode 6 ended with Cruz's face just looked completely like with a certain kind of terror, like, what am I gonna do now?
Yeah, exactly. I think she just got inserted even deeper, to say the least.
I'll say. All right. Well, I think we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you, Shannon. So glad you were back to join us this week. And I loved having Lory on.
Oh, she's
amazing.
Yeah. Thank you for everything, Sean.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. Please like and share this podcast wherever you can across your social media. You can go on to YouTube. And if you're on there, please subscribe, ring the bell. If you'd like to reach out to me, Sean, SHAUN at veteransbreakfastclub.org, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments about the Lioness Origin Story podcast. And we will be back with another episode of Lioness in the near future with more special guests Daria and Shannon, thank you both so much. It's so educational and so historic, this podcast. I'm so happy that we're able to be a part of it.
Thank you, Sean. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.